I'm talking today about the long-term impact of the protest cycle of the late 1960s and early 1970s on Japanese society today. But I think it's also relevant to what is happening in American society, and I'd like you to think about that as you're listening to it. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Japan experienced a major protest cycle that addressed a wide range of social issues and involved students, political parties of the left, and ordinary citizens. Social movement scholars have learned that social movements or protest movements tend to rise and fall over time. A protest cycle is a period in which social movements escalate, often into and then there are large-scale confrontations that the state tries to control. Sometimes these escalate further into civil wars or revolutions, but most often the conflict reaches a peak and then declines, leaving the society intact, but perhaps altered by the experience. This particular protest cycle arose not just in Japan, but all across the United States and much of Western Europe at basically the same time, informed by new left ideas that developed first in Latin America and post-colonial societies, but soon were taken up by college students across the developed world. Recently, there's been renewed interest in this period because 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the 1968 protests, the year that's regarded as the peak of new left protests around the world. Much has happened in Japan since this protest cycle ended in the mid-1970s, but I contend that it has both positive and negative effects that are still relevant in Japan today. I've come to this topic from an odd angle. While the protest cycle was building, I was in Japan doing dissertation research on the pre-war Japanese communist movement, and that movement violated a special peace preservation law that outlawed group activities that opposed the capitalist economic system, or the kokutai, the national essence. After these pre-war activists were arrested and being prosecuted for their ideologically motivated actions, they had renounced their beliefs and actions in a process that came to be called tenko, or change of direction. I studied how the procurators, what we would call prosecutors today, in the Thought Bureau focused on getting the prisoners to recant their beliefs and then studied the prisoners' own accounts of their experiences. I concluded that in the pre-war Japanese context, they were particularly vulnerable to those tenko pressures. Consequently, I wondered whether the structural changes that the Allied occupation brought to the constitution and the education system in post-war Japan would better equip a new post-war generation of young Japanese to resist such pressures if they put themselves into a similar situation of confronting the state and being arrested and prosecuted for it. After finishing my dissertation, I began to study the New Left protest cycle of the late 1960s as my post-war comparative case study. The topic was too sensitive for fieldwork until the early 1980s, when I began to focus on the Red Army faction, its successors in Japan and abroad, and others groups whose paths crossed with the Red Army. I continued to study these groups long after the protest cycle ended, following them as they moved into Japanese criminal justice system, including those that had gone into exile to continue their activism, and then most of them later came back. I'm now finishing the expanded and updated English version of a book that I published in Japanese in 1991 on how the New Left developed in Japan, leading to the protest cycle of the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the emergence of the Red Army faction at the peak of protest activity. It follows the extreme events of the early 1970s, the mass incarceration of young activists, and how they resisted after their arrest with the help of a new institution that provided support to arrested New Left activists. Only now am I able to finish that book, which is now part of a trilogy and focuses on what happened inside Japan. I will first provide an overview of the New Left protest cycle of the late 1960s and early 70s to give you the flavor of what it entailed, and then we'll analyze its major long-term impacts on Japanese society. In the Japanese context, New Left means Marxist, but not affiliated with the Japan Communist Party. The JCP had helped to build the post-war student movement from the campus level through citywide and regional groups up to a national organization called Zengakuren, which means All Japan National Student Association, based on the elected student government organizations at the campus level, which controlled a portion of student fees as well as the income from running student co-ops. They in turn paid dues to support the higher levels. Through most of the early post-war period, the JCP controlled the national student organization by cultivating its top leadership. In 1958, the majority of the national Zengakuren leadership broke with the JCP and formed an independent New Left organization called Kyösanshugisha Domei, Communist League, nicknamed Bund. As the elected Zengakuren leadership, Bund led the mainstream of the student movement that mobilized students to participate in the massive 1960 protests opposing renewal of the US-Japan Joint Security Treaty, or ANTIWAR. When the treaty was renewed, despite massive protests, Bund dissolved into several factions. However, the treaty would come up for renewal again in 1970. By 1965, a new generation of students began rebuilding the student movement in anticipation of the 1970 ANTIWAR renewal. There was no longer a unified national organization, but instead several different New Left organizations, plus student groups affiliated with the Japan Communist Party and the Japan Socialist Party, the Old Left, competed for control of student government and its financial resources at the campus level. The winners participated in city and regional student federations and maintained national organizations staffed by former student leaders. At the national level, each of these organizations saw itself as an extra-parliamentary political party that aspired to lead a revolution in Japan and developed its own theory from which it could derive a position on virtually any political activity that arose. These sects, alternately allying and competing with one another, drove the escalation that characterized the New Left protest cycle. I've primarily followed the Bund lineage because it was a major player in the New Left protest cycle, and the Red Army faction formed within it and then split from it. New Left student organizations in the late 1960s mobilized students to participate in protests around a large number of issues that were shared with other civil society groups, as well as labor unions and the political parties of the left. Some, such as US military-based issues, opposition to the Vietnam War, the building of the new international airport at Narita, and peace and anti-nuclear movements, were related to the impending renewal of the Security Treaty in 1970, whose central issue was the return of Okinawa to Japanese control. Japan's high growth policies that had caused industrial pollution and pollution-related diseases produced new issues, as did international issues involving former colonies of the Japanese Empire and growing awareness of discrimination against domestic minorities. Student organizations participated in street demonstrations and other activities in support of all these activities, often as part of a broader national coalition and in response to specific plans of the national government. However, the Liberal Democratic Party was securely in control of the government and could ignore even massive protests. Increasingly frustrated by their inability to get a response, the students began to organize their own protest actions to confront the authorities more directly. This led to a gradual escalation as they innovated new confrontational tactics, and the authorities responded with increased force to control them. It should also be emphasized that the Japanese student movement, unlike its American counterpart, had never had an ethic of nonviolence, and thus did not use the tactic of nonviolent resistance to counter police violence against them. One early event in this escalation was the first HANEDA incident of October 8, 1967, when Prime Minister Sato was supposed to depart on a trip to Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. There was widespread opposition to the trip because of its direct relation to the Vietnam War and the Security Treaty, but the students decided to try to prevent his departure from Haneda Airport. This was the first protest at which students arrived wearing crash helmets and armed with fighting poles, previously used only for internal conflicts between different student sects. They planned to throw rocks at the police, as they had begun to do in previous events. This time, the police used their big gray buses to block the bridges leading to Haneda Airport and came armed with giant nets to protect themselves against the rock throwing. As this photo shows, the students crawled on top of the police vehicles and taunted them with their flags. And in several skirmishes, the police retreated to the other side of the bridge to avoid the hail of rocks, which the students on site and those watching the event unfold on live television interpreted as evidence that if they just escalated their tactics a bit more, they could defeat the police. A student was later killed on the Benten Bridge when students took control of an empty police car on the bridge, drove it into the loudspeaker with a loudspeaker blaring for everyone to follow them into the airport, and accidentally ran over him. Everything stopped, and when the students later returned to Benten Bridge to hold a brief memorial service, the police sprayed them with high-powered water cannons laced with tear gas, its first use since the 1960 AMPO protests, forcing many of them into the water. In what was to become the typical pattern of reciprocal escalation, for the next confrontation, the riot police arrived wearing face shields and full-body duraluminum shields to deflect rocks and poles and also to bang the students' helmets. A series of big protest events during the first half of 1968 still had broad public support. In January 1968, the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise planned a port call at Yokosuka near Tokyo. Anticipating major protests, the government got the US military to move the port call to Sasebo in far southwestern Japan. Still, large contingents of students took trains and buses to the area and arranged to stay overnight with local students in Kyushu. They joined others from the police and the peace and anti-nuclear movements, plus local residents, in several days of protests at Sasebo. When the police attacked the students, many of the students supported and protected them. Later that spring, local residents objected strongly to the US military's plan to build a large field hospital to deal with Vietnam War casualties at Camp Oji, located in a dense residential area in northern Tokyo. These protests also involved both local area participants and large contingents of students. After a month of protests, the governor of Tokyo intervened and persuaded the US military to move the field hospital to another base at a more distant Tokyo location. However, by the fall of 1968, as street demonstrations devolved into direct clashes between student protesters and riot police, the government sought stronger measures to control the students. At a major national protest on International Anti-War Day, October 21st, many different groups held street protests in various parts of Tokyo and then converged in the early evening on Shinjuku Station, Japan's busiest commuter and long-distance rail station. It had become a focal point for protest because freight trains carrying fuel and other war materials for the US military also were allowed to transit through Shinjuku Station. One New Left sect had arranged to have its fighting poles and stones placed one train stop away from Shinjuku. They got off there, picked up their battle equipment, then got back on the train and rode directly into Shinjuku Station, where they fought with riot police and threw stones at the train cars, while thousands of other protesters chanted outside. The event was declared a riot, which allowed the police to arrest anyone who did not leave immediately, and also to bring felony charges against the leaders of the offending groups for inciting a riot by their public communications, even if they were not physically present at the scene. In addition to the increasingly violent street protests, in 1968, a separate Zenkyoto movement organized students to protest the actions of their own university administrations. This movement was open to all students at a particular campus and used mass meetings to decide on demands, and it carried out student strikes when their demands were not met. Although the Zenkyoto movement began with a loose participatory approach, the New Left sects often took over control of occupied buildings on striking campuses, using chemistry labs to build firebombs and invent new small explosives. Occupied campuses thus became rear staging areas for more violent protest activities outside the campuses. Private universities quickly called in the riot police to end strikes and clear their campuses. but major national and public universities abided by an earlier understanding that police could not come onto campus unless they were called unless they were invited. So strikes paralyzed those institutions for months. In 1968 and 1969, a total of 162 universities were engulfed in student strikes until the government passed a new university control law that allowed the Momosho to intervene and take over if the institution could not end the conflict in 6 months. One of the biggest strikes at the University of Tokyo came to a spectacular conclusion when administrators who had already canceled the incoming spring class finally called in the riot police on the weekend of January 18th and 19th, 1969. As an indication of how seriously the situation was regarded, the Asahi newspaper that had long supported student involvement in protests editorialized. The security authorities, government, and Democratic Party have decided that the Todai conflict is no longer just a Todai conflict, but has become a struggle against state authority that is intended to destroy Tokyo Imperialist University. For that reason, the bureaucracy, the political world, and the financial world feel a sense of impending crisis to the social structure, which, along with the rising public opinion hoping for normalization of Todai, has encouraged the police. This fuses the argument of the most extreme of the Zenkyoto militants with the impact it had on Japan's Iron Triangle, who were heavily Todai graduates. It also referenced 2 opinion polls taken by the Cabinet Office in December 1968, which showed that the public's support for the student protest was waning and would tolerate more decisive action. It took 8,500 riot police 2 days to clear the occupied buildings, culminating at Yasuda Auditorium, the iconic symbol of the university and its main administration building. Over 70% of the television viewing audience watched the final hours of the episode live. Large numbers of non-Todai students were arrested on campus, and hundreds more who had gathered from all over the country were arrested at a Parisian-style barricade conflict in the nearby Kanda bookstore district. The end of 1968 and beginning of 1969 marked a new state policy to crack down on student protest, which only became visible to the students and their supporters gradually as the jails filled up and the students were not released in a few days, as had previously been the case. Overall, 6,171 students were arrested in 1968 and 13,497 in 1969. And over that time, larger and larger proportions of them were actually indicted and prosecuted. In response to these changes, a group of sympathizers established Kyuen Rennaku Center, nicknamed Kyuen, which means Relief Contact Center, in early 1969 to provide support to arrested students. In direct reference to pre-war Tenko, the Kyuen strategy was to counsel arrested students to resist pressures to confess by refusing to talk to interrogators. They would make their one permitted phone call, which they couldn't make themselves, but the police would make for them, to ask for legal representation from lawyers who had signed up with Kyuen to provide. The Kyuen office maintained a 24-hour hotline, and students memorized the phone number through its mnemonic, Goku Iri Imi Oi, or 5911301, which translates as going to jail has great meaning. Upon receiving the phone call from the local police station, using the student's booking number since they refused to give their names, Kyuen dispatched a lawyer to do an interview and find out necessary information, including whether the student needed medical care and how to contact their parents and friends without police knowledge. They also mobilized huge numbers of supporters to go to the police stations where the students were held and send in food and other supplies, called sashiire, which persons being held in unconvicted detention were allowed to receive from the outside. The aim was to support the students so that they were less vulnerable to being manipulated into confession by interrogators. QN also then contacted the students' parents and friends, encouraging them not to show up at the police station themselves, but rather to channel their support through QN, so the arrested students would not face further vulnerability from parental pressure to confess, and their friends would not get arrested for helping them. The price of using the QN system to resist by using a lawyer to fight the charges through a full trial was that it exposed them to greater pressure from the criminal justice system and guaranteed that they would spend a much longer time behind bars, but it gave them the resources to maintain their convictions and keep fighting. QN also helped the arrested students' friends and family form support groups for the trial of each group. Those support groups helped the lawyers prepare for trial and organized visits to the students being held in unconvicted detention to keep up their spirits. They produced newsletters to report on the trials, which were mailed to supporters both inside and outside the jails. And they reported regularly about the prisoners in the QN newspaper that was mailed to a wide array of subscribers and also was sold through a network of small alternative bookstores. As protests became more violent in 1969, with firebombs regularly used in big demonstrations, much of the earlier public support for the students faded away. Groups that did not want to be tarnished by student violence refused to demonstrate with them because they would suddenly break away and begin fighting with the riot police. It also led to conflicts within the student movement sects, where moderate participants opposed those who pushed for more extreme tactics. It was precisely this dynamic that led to the emergence of the Red Army faction within Bund, which was a very large public organization in the student movement mainstream. As another large faction left Bund, there was a need for experienced manpower to fill their places in Tokyo, and a large number of senior leaders from the Kansai area moved to Tokyo to take over some key leadership positions in Bund. They included Shiomi Takaya, who was the national head of Bund's student organization, Shagakudo, and emerged as the Red Army faction's leading theorist, and Tamiya Takamaro, a creative tactician from Osaka, who became the head of planning and preparation for Bund's protest events, and later the architect of the Red Army factor's exploits. As key leaders of the Kansai Bund moved to Tokyo, they felt a bit out of place in the Tokyo environment and met regularly to discuss politics in familiar Kansai dialect, bringing with them the Kansai Bund's tradition of learning through direct action. Shiomi was also widely read in New Left literature from around the world. He befriended a member of New Left representatives from the US and Europe who had come to Japan to participate in a big symposium sponsored by the anti-Vietnam war organization Behaden in August 1968, and had taken him on a lecture tour of major student campuses around Japan. At that time, Shiomi was already articulating the idea that mass student protest had reached a dead end, and to move forward, they needed to form an underground army in order to pursue more militant tactics, with the ultimate aim of cooperating with similar revolutionary groups around the world to bring about revolutionary change in Japan. Bund had always envisioned itself as participating in worldwide revolution, but did little beyond paying lip service to the idea. When Shiomi and the Kansai Bund leaders began advocating it more explicitly within Bund, the other factions opposed the idea and dubbed them the Red Army faction. Shiomi still thought that they could win over the others and take control of Bund, but by the summer of 1969, the rift had widened into open conflict, and Bund finally ejected the Red Army faction. It immediately reorganized as an independent faction that still controlled large groups of students at many striking campuses, and made its public debut in early 1969 with a skirmish at a big convention inaugurating a national Zenkyoto organization. The Red Army faction didn't think a national Zenkyoto organization was a viable way forward, but it was an opportunity to present themselves to a national audience. Their publicly announced real plan was a series of small attacks on police boxes to try to obtain guns, dubbed with typical hyperbole, the Osaka War, the Kyoto War, and the Tokyo War, which were supposedly coordinated with the US SDS Weatherman faction with the October 1969 Days of Rage in Chicago. The attacks fizzled and failed to get any weapons. Secretly, their members had developed two small devices that we would now call IEDs, or improved explosive devices. One was a peace can bomb, using the cans from peace cigarettes, and the other was a pipe bomb. To train members to use them without blowing themselves up, they arranged for a weekend training camp at a mountain park near Tokyo in early November. Because they'd been way too public about their plans and were well known to the police, the participants were followed to the site at DAIBOSATSU and were awakened at dawn by a police raid at the inn where they were staying. You can see they were awakened at dawn and they've gone outside with bare feet or just slippers on. All 58 participants were arrested and the police confiscated extensive materials about their next plan, which turned out to be a plot to kidnap the prime minister and hold him hostage so he could not leave on a planned trip to the United States on November 17th. Although the plot had been foiled by the arrests at DAIBOSATSU, the Red Army faction was now perceived as a serious national threat. The leaders dropped out of sight completely, and known participants were subjected to 24-hour personal surveillance, surrounded by up to 6 plainclothes police, who followed them everywhere. The newly independent Red Army faction did not support itself with student fees as other groups did, but it had been accumulating a lot of money through sales of its publications and the practice of having students appear in front of train stations with an upturned helmet to solicit contributions, or kampa. As that became less feasible, the group was able to obtain a steady flow of contributions from working adults who quietly supported them. On the surface, the Red Army faction appeared to have disappeared, but she only published a new manifesto in January 1970, arguing that in order to achieve their goals, they needed to establish international bases in friendly countries where they could learn military tactics, obtain weapons, and then return to Japan to lead an uprising in fall 1970. Then, in March 1970, the Red Army faction made a dramatic reappearance with Japan's first domestic airline hijacking, in which 9 Red Army hijackers improbably demanded to be taken to North Korea. Led by Tamiya Takamaro, they became known as the Yodogö group after the name of the Japan Airlines plane that they had hijacked. Shiomi had been involved in the planning, but he was arrested a couple of weeks before it occurred and spent the next 20-some years behind bars. The hijacking was front-page news for days because the plane was diverted to Seoul, where the airport had been disguised to look like it was in North Korea, with girls in traditional Korean dresses greeting the plane. The ruse failed because Tamiya had noticed a Northwest Airlines plane in the far corner of the tarmac. After a long standoff, the North Korean Red Cross signaled that North Korea would accept the hijackers, and the 9 hijackers and a Japanese Diet member who had agreed to serve as a substitute hostage were flown to Pyongyang. The Diet member and the plane were quickly returned to a celebration in Tokyo, and the 9 hijackers were swallowed up in North Korea, where they remained. After the youngest hijacker was discovered in Japan in the late 1980s and arrested, QN sent a delegation to Pyongyang to discuss the trial. Thereafter, Takazawa Koji, the donor of our Takazawa collection, who had known Tamiya through publishing Red Army faction materials, met regularly with the group and published many of their writings in Japan. However, he became suspicious of their activities and in 1998 published a prize-winning work of nonfiction that exposed their secret activities as North Korean agents involved in the luring of young Japanese to North Korea. Several of the students who've worked with me to catalog the Takazawa collection later translated the book into English, and it was published by the University Press of Hawaii Press in 2018. The Red Army faction had lost its original leadership to arrests and the hijacking, but the group tried to soldier on without them despite heavy surveillance. Tamiya had brought back Mori Tsuneya, a former member who had left the group in the summer before they'd been ousted from Bund, because he had the theoretical skills needed to lead the group. They now had a fair number of people living underground, and it was getting harder to support their activities. So Mori turned to what underground groups usually do under those circumstances. They became bank robbers. For about a year, from September 1970 to summer 1971, The underground cells of the Red Army faction carried out a number of successful robberies of banks and post offices, which in Japan also handle large sums of money for a postal savings system. These robberies were publicly understood to be the work of student activists rather than traditional criminals. They brought in a lot of cash, but forced the underground cells to constantly change their lodgings and led to a number of arrests. In February 1971, Shigenobu Fusako, the only woman on the Red Army Faction Central Committee, went to Lebanon with Okudaira Tsuyoshi to set up an international base for the Red Army in the Middle East. They volunteered with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, and a faction of the Palestine Liberation Organization with an ideology compatible with the Red Army factions. Okudaira volunteered with the group's external military unit to obtain military training, while Shigenobu volunteered with the public relations section that published a newspaper and other materials. She soon made arrangements for Wakamatsu Productions to produce a film, Sekigun PFLP Sekai Kakume Sengen, Red Army PFLP Declaration of International Revolution, which was shown around Japanese college campuses to recruit others to join the Red Army group in the Middle East. It showed PFLP fighters in the Middle East casually handling military rifles, which would have been appealing to Japanese young people who wanted to become revolutionary guerrilla fighters. Meanwhile, some other groups had been going underground. One was a remote offshoot of a Maoist group that had been expelled from the Japan Communist Party called Kakume Saha Revolutionary Left. In the same month that Shigenobu left for the Middle East, this group robbed a gun shop in the country town of Moka in Tochigi Prefecture, netting a number of rifles, an air gun, and a lot of ammunition. After the robbery, the team that carried it out, led by Sakaguchi Hiroshi and Nagata Hiroko, successfully eluded a multi-prefecture dragnet and escaped to Hokkaido, where they holed up for months in a small room with dwindling resources. In the spring, they cautiously ventured out and returned to Tokyo, where they sold one of the guns to the Red Army faction, which later lost it while escaping from a robbery. The leaders of Kakume Saha then went into the mountains west of Tokyo, where they found a cabin to stay in and began inviting other members to join them to prepare for revolution. Over the late summer of 1971, Mori engineered a merger of convenience between the two groups, which together harbored most of the people on Japan's 10 most wanted list, despite their ideological differences. They called the new group Rengo Sekigun, or United Red Army. By fall 1971, Mori had only a handful of underground Red Army members left, but he took them into the mountains along with a few people from the legal support operation that had been showing the film around the country. Mori and Nagata, with a small number of other members, formed a leadership group that met more or less continuously to try to hammer out their policy differences, while the others took care of maintaining a collective household, which included a number of women and a one-year-old. Over the winter of 1971-72, the group moved several times, built new cabins, and sent people out to get supplies periodically. Under Mori's leadership, they fell into a disastrous internal purge that was intended to toughen up the newest and weakest recruits for the harsh treatment they anticipated they would receive after they were arrested. But instead, they ended up torturing a dozen of their members to death. Mori had explained the first death as death by defeatism, which blamed the victims and created the illusion that the group members were not responsible for their deaths, even though they were increasingly compelled to participate in the torture in order to avoid becoming victims themselves. By February, the police in two prefectures had begun, Gumaken and Nagoya, had begun to close in on them. A few members escaped while on errands, and Mori and Nagata were caught returning from a trip to Tokyo. Separate police units had been tracking the Red Army faction and Revolutionary Left, but they didn't really understand that they had merged, and Mori was initially misidentified as a member of Revolutionary Left. Learning of the arrests, the remaining members hastily packed up their gear and the weapons and began a long trek over the mountaintops because the roads were no longer safe. They ended up in the resort town of Karuizawa on the other side of the mountains, where one group split off and went to the railroad station, where they attracted attention because of their ragged appearance and body odors and were quickly arrested. 4 men and 1 teenage boy in the other group headed back uphill with police pursuing them, but managed to escape and find a mountain lodge that was well stocked and admirably suited for defense, where they took the caretaker's wife hostage and prepared for a siege. The top floor of the building faced the road at the back, but the rest of it hung down the mountainside. And there was another hairpin curve of the mountain road down there that could be easily, it could be easily protected from attack by the weapons that the group had. Because of the hostage, the police did not try to attack Asama Sanso corporate lodge, but instead brought in riot police reinforcements and settled down to wait while reporters with telephoto lenses filmed the standoff from the next mountain over. All of Japan waited for 10 days while reporters were filming the standoff. And on the last day, with the whole event broadcast live on Japanese television to 90% of the viewing audience, the police brought in a wrecking cane and methodically demolished the top floor entrance to the building, sprayed water laced with tear gas inside, and began carefully searching for the occupants. They had retreated to a bedroom on the very bottom level to wait, barricaded behind shoji and mattresses, with the hostage and the youngest boy huddled behind the others. After several hours, the police emerged with the hostage and the 5 fugitives unharmed. Takazawa Koji waited out the entire siege in the area as the representative of the Red Army's support group stationed at the nearby hospital in the expectation that injured survivors would be taken there, but there were no injuries. Only as police began interrogating the earlier arrestees did they begin to learn about the terrible purge that had taken place over the winter. As the news began to get out, and police began digging up bodies where they had been buried in remote locations in the woods in 2 prefectures, the entire nation recoiled from the tragedy. The temporal reversal between the Asama Sanso siege and the belated discovery of the internal purge that happened before that increased the shock of learning about it. Pundits and instant experts began trying to make sense of what had happened. New left supporters who'd watched the siege play out while cheering for its success despite the strange location were bewildered. Many had lost friends in the purge, and many more realized that they too might have ended up there. They tried to explain it using their own theoretical frames, but could not. Kyuan was involved in supporting the first arrestees in Nagano and stayed involved through all the trials, which only ended in the early 1990s. Minor participants who had escaped before the final siege at Asama Sanso were tried in the prefectures where they were arrested, while most of those who had made it over the mountains, plus Nagata and Mori, were eventually tried in Tokyo. Some of the revolutionary left defendants were also charged with 2 earlier murders that group had carried out, while leaders in both groups had already been wanted by the police before the merger and now had murder charges added. The shock of the Asama Sanso siege and the temporarily reversed United Red Army purge brought an end to the New Left protest cycle, although some activity continued both in Japan and overseas. 3 months after these events, the world woke up to a new shock when 3 young Japanese men attacked Lod Airport, now Tel Aviv Airport, in Israel, killing 26 people and injuring many more. Sent by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in the Middle East, they had initially disguised their names and identities, but had soon been identified as Japanese. The arrest of Okamoto Kozo, the lone survivor of the attack, was actually the trigger for my research project. I interviewed him in Israel right after his trial ended, but to pursue my sociological questions, I needed to understand the social context in Japan that had led him there, how he got to the Middle East. And the things that the Red Army did there are the subject of a separate book that I cannot pursue here, but their paths periodically intersected. So let's return to what was happening in Japan after the Lod Airport attack. An unrelated group called Higashi Asia Hannichi Buso Sensen, East Asia Anti-Japanese Armed Front, carried out a surreptitious bombing campaign as retribution for the actions of major Japanese corporations during the Second World War, including a devastating bombing of the headquarters of the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Corporation in downtown Tokyo in 1974 that killed 8 people and injured 376, most from glass shards falling from the front of the glass-walled building onto people outside on their way to lunch. The deeply underground perpetrators were only caught en masse in 1975 after a very lengthy investigation. They had viewed themselves as the only surviving New Left organization and had carried cyanide capsules to commit suicide if they were arrested. Only one person was able to swallow his cyanide, and the others had their cyanide capsules taken away when they were arrested. QN was involved in the case from the beginning, but had to teach the survivors that they could use the QN approach to continue resistance. The 3 women in particular became very adept at resisting the prison regime while they were in unconvicted detention and spent much of their time in punishment cells. Meanwhile, the Japanese Red Army group in the Middle East that had taken responsibility for the Lod Airport attack was involved in several other international attacks while working as volunteers for PFLP in 1973 and 1974. After they became an independent Japanese group with the name Japanese Red Army, they carried out 2 additional Free the guerrilla attacks to retrieve people from Japanese prisons, and one was an attack on some embassies in one building in Kuala Lumpur in 1975, and the other was an airplane hijacking in Bangladesh in 1977. Both of these attacks succeeded in getting the Japanese government to release prisoners who then went with them to the Middle East. Many of those people were subsequently tracked down and deported back to Japan in the late 1980s and 1990s, where they were put on trial. While that story is beyond the limits of my current book, these incidents involving Japanese are part of my larger research project and are part of the Japanese public's understanding of the period and its long-term impact on Japan. With this overview of what the Japanese New Left protest cycle was about, let's now look at what the long-term impacts of this set of events in the late 1960s and early 1970s has had that can still be seen in contemporary Japan half a century later. I see 3 major impacts, all of which have both negative and positive implications. The first is the effect on public attitudes towards protest. This impact of the protest cycle that it had on Japanese society as a whole was deeper and more negative than in any of the other countries that had a similar New Left protest cycle during the same period. Because I was deeply engrossed in trying to understand the people who were directly involved in the protest and whose lives had been drastically changed by their participation, it's taken me a long time to appreciate how those events appeared to the rest of the Japanese population. I now believe the New Left protest cycle produced a very deep cultural trauma that remains unprocessed even today in Japanese society. In the early part of the protest cycle until late 1968, there was considerable support for the issues of the protests and for the involvement of students. The students were on the front lines and took the brunt of the police response. So many Japanese citizens and journalists who saw how students were treated in demonstrations sympathized and supported them. Yet as violence escalated, public opinion shifted. Because the government understood that there was considerable support and sympathy for the protests and the students, the Cabinet Office commissioned 2 surveys at the end of 1968, which revealed that support for the students was declining. That assured the leadership that they could safely escalate repressive measures to control the protests. There were public threats as early as the 1967 first HANEDA incident to apply the Subversive Activities Control Law, which would have defined the protest or individual leaders as seditious, but that did not happen until 2 years later. Normally, the speech and writings of sect leaders were constitutionally protected free speech for which no one could be prosecuted. Declaring a riot and then arresting those that did not immediately leave the area changed the definition from free speech to inciting to riot. It made leaders responsible for the actions their followers took that could be connected to what they had written, even if they were not present at the scene. These attempts to threaten or actually invoke more serious felony laws to control street protests increased the tools the state could use to tamp down protests, but also signaled to the general public that the authorities were taking care of the threatening situation. The long-running conflict at the University of Tokyo, the pinnacle of the higher education system and the alma mater of a very high proportion of national government officials, epitomized the deepening sense of social threat that people felt, particularly of this second front in the conflict that was rapidly paralyzing universities. The Asahi Shimbun editorial on the day the riot police entered the Todai campus expressed this perfectly. The central organs of the nation had decided that the conflict at Todai threatened the social structure of Japan itself and therefore had to be stopped. This marked the public peak of the protest cycle. The state intervened forcefully to bend the curve, and in the process, forced part of the movement underground, where its actions were much harder to control. My co-authors and I, who've studied the Japanese, American, and European New Left protest cycles, contributed to the theory of protest cycles by demonstrating that the underground activity, which other scholars had treated as something completely different from the waxing and waning of public protest, was actually intrinsically related to how police responded to the escalation phase of the protest cycle. We saw it because we've been following activists as they moved underground in order to continue the fight. Unlike the social response to the leaders of the 1960 AMPO protests, who were sought after by government and private corporations because of their demonstrated leadership ability, participants in the New Left protests a few years later were systematically excluded from employment in major corporations and government, especially if they'd ever been arrested. The protests coincided with Japan's era of high growth and a massive expansion of higher education in a system where just entering college generally opened the door to prestigious middle-class permanent employment. Many were first-generation college students whose families were very proud of their academic success, only to have their hopes dashed when the gates to the most prestigious routes to success were suddenly shut. Yet because of Japan's rising prosperity, the New Left veterans did not end up on the streets. Instead, they took their talents to other parts of the economy, to more independent professions and smaller companies. Many worked for small publishers, taught in private cram schools, or made a living through freelance writing. While sophisticated parents living in the metropolis might be more tolerant, families from smaller cities and rural areas faced severe social disapproval if their children had been involved in protest activity, particularly if they'd been publicly associated with some of the more extreme events. They genuinely feared the social consequences of their children's political activity, which also came back directly on the parents and families. Beyond the institutional exclusion of the student activists themselves, as a response to the student strikes, many private universities, which constituted the absolute majority of institutions of higher education at the time, eliminated their student government organizations. This cut off both the transmission of political ideas through student political organizations and their capacity to mobilize successive generations of students to participate in protest movements. Separately, the reorganization of labor union federations in the 1980s also reduced labor's capacity to mobilize workers for social movement activity, which in turn weakened the major left political parties, even though its original aim was to counter the dominance of the LDP and move toward a more balanced two-party system. Japanese mass media, particularly television, also played a major role in encouraging, prolonging, and reinforcing fear of protest. By the late 1960s, a high proportion of Japanese households had television sets. The key events of the protest cycle were broadcast live on Japanese television and thus gave people a ringside seat to these events in their living rooms. The same thing happened in the United States, where the Vietnam War was on evening television. Ever since the protest ended in the mid-1970s, Japanese television stations have repurposed all their dramatic footage of protest events into special programs to commemorate protest anniversaries. They strung together iconic clips of many different major protest events that happened over a long time period, often carried out by very different groups, without any explanation of their perpetrators or purpose. The effect was to convey a powerful image of meaningless violence repeated over and over, which served only to evoke horror and re-traumatize the audience. Even Wakamatsu Koji's otherwise sympathetic film about the Red Army groups, which was shown in the Berlin Film Festival a few years ago, it incorporates such sequences for dramatic effect. Since I use those same images in presentations, I've tried to explain the aims of each event as the participants understood them and to place them in context within the overall protest cycle. The combined effect of these thwarted ambitions in institutional changes and social messages has had a strong impact on socialization within the family. Since the 1970s, with the exception of former New Left participants themselves, mainstream Japanese parents have feared that their children might get caught up in protest and have instilled in them a strong need to stay away from it as a frightening, socially stigmatized activity that could deeply jeopardize their future. That fear has been passed down for half a century and can still be seen in Japanese society today, even though there has been some resurgence of participation in social movements by young people since the 1990s. The fact that young people who protest often have parents who also did so is not unique to Japan. It is common in the social movement literature to acknowledge the presence of red diaper babies whose parents had a history of protest activity. Yet the New Left protest cycle enveloped a much broader range of students and was quite mainstream activity during the late 1960s. So it's unusual for the stigmatized image of protest based on the violence of the latter part of the cycle to persist for half a century. It shows up even today in involuntary expressions of fear and avoidance among young people when protest symbols appear. It also can be observed in the deep reluctance of young mothers in post-3/11 Japan who engage in social movement activity to acknowledge that what they do is political activism because the social stigma remains so strong. Second, is QN as the support for arrested protesters to continue to resist. It's telling that the government chose to escalate repressive measures very quietly at the end of 1968 by increasing the arrests of students and then not releasing them after a short period, as had been the normal practice. Consequently, there was no sudden visible change in policy. Instead, nothing on the surface appeared to change, and the students only discovered what was happening when people were held in jail long after it would have normally been the case. In addition, more and more people were indicted and prosecuted for more serious offenses than the usual demonstration-related misdemeanors. Professors and fellow students who were close to the students who were arrested and not being released were paying attention. They came together with some sympathetic cause lawyers to organize QN to provide support to the arrested students. This confluence of events also reveals that by 1969, in part because of the Zenkyoto movement, there were many more unaffiliated students participating in protests and getting arrested. Prior to 1969, the major New Left sects already had lawyers on retainer to provide assistance if their members got arrested. As the movement itself was fragmenting into more factions, and students who did not belong to the major sects were increasingly getting involved in protests that ended in arrests, the need for a broader institution to organize support increased sharply. When I began to do fieldwork on this topic in 1982, one of the first places I was taken to was the small QN office in Shimbashi. It has been central to my research ever since. Despite that, it still took me quite a while to realize that QN itself was the institutional answer to my research question about whether and how post-war student activists were better able to resist the pressures that ensued when they were arrested for confronting the state directly. From my pre-war research on Tenko, I had learned to see individual activists whose ties to their own organizations were seriously weakened by their arrest and incarceration, and who were therefore alone and very vulnerable to pressure from the Thought Bureau. There was, in fact, a pre-war parallel to QN, an organization of the Comintern called Red Relief, with the acronym MOPR, M-O-P-R, that tried to provide assistance to arrested members of the JCP. However, in my few interviews with Tenko survivors and my reading of the literature they produced called Tenko Bungaku, Red Relief appeared only 1 or 2 times because someone had received a small bottle of milk sent into the prison as sashiire. Such gestures had a strong impact, but were so rare they were not sufficient to withstand the pressures to Tenko. Initially, I thought it would be a combination of the stronger role of defense lawyers in the post-war legal system and the individualism taught in the early post-war school curriculum, especially by left-leaning teachers who taught things that weren't in formal curriculum that would produce individuals better able to stand up to the state. Those things did matter, but in the long run, it was QN as a social movement organization, a specific institution designed to provide the necessary range of support that enabled groups of young activists arrested for their political activities to resist confession and keep fighting despite their prolonged extreme isolation in unconvicted detention. Although there were some similar organizations in post-war Japan that served specific organizations such as the JCP, QN was a product of New Left culture in 2 respects. First, it limited its services to members of it did not limit its services to members of particular organizations or any organization at all, although it generally served people who were ideologically within the New Left. Secondly, its organizational structure was non-hierarchical. It serves simply as a clearinghouse that provides some services directly and also helps groups of students and their associates organize their own support group for a particular trial. As groups of New Left activists faced much more serious criminal charges in the 1970s and beyond, the trial support groups affiliated with QN dealt with much smaller groups of dependents over trials that lasted for more than a decade with appeals. Some have continued to support the prisoners while they were serving their sentences, and if they were released after they returned to society. They have also supported 4 persons who received death sentences that were confirmed in the early 1990s from 2 different organizations, the Red Army and Hanmichi. The support groups have carried out civil lawsuits on their behalf, as well as providing social and material support, and in some cases have entered into legal family relationships in order to continue to be able to visit them after their death sentences were confirmed. Both of the pairs of defendants had co-defendants who had been released to the Japanese Red Army to go to the Middle East while their trials were in progress, and subsequently remained at large outside of Japan. Because of a prior precedent, the Justice Ministry was very reluctant to carry out the death sentences in a case where the absent co-defendants were returned to Japan to resume their trials, and the convicted defendants were needed as witnesses for a subsequent trial. Consequently, as of 2020, 2 of the death row convicts have died of illness in prison, and one of the other 2 has dementia. They have been in Tokyo House of Detention since the early 1970s. in unconvicted detention until their sentences were finalized in the early 1990s, and in the same institution but in much more severe isolation since then. These trial support groups have been incredibly inventive and dedicated to finding new ways to support their prisoners. And in the process, they have brought lawsuits that have materially changed the conditions under which persons awaiting the death penalty are held. While these cases are not cited in the changes to the penal code and prison regulations that happened around the turn of the century, it's apparent that the changes would not have come about without these legal challenges by trial support groups. QN still exists today and serves not only its original clients from the New Left protest cycle of the 60s and 70s, but also now makes its services available to the current generation of young people who risk arrest through their involvement in social movements. More broadly, the Japanese model of trial support groups, which was, while it was not invented by QN, has certainly been expanded and adapted into a sophisticated form of advocacy for social change that combines cause lawyers working in combination with trial support groups that assist both the lawyers and the principals in the case. The model has been used in both criminal and civil cases. For many years, this work was regarded as futile because the cases rarely succeeded. More recent research, including good comparative research involving Korean and Japanese cases, has found that this Japanese model of close cooperation and effective timing between cause lawyers and trial supports as a form of social movement activity has succeeded in many cases. And my third conclusion is that the New Left's invisible civil society in advance served as a bridge to contemporary protest movements, and I'll explain that in more detail. During its heyday in the New Left protest cycle, the New Left also produced a vibrant and creative new culture that developed new organizational forms and some characteristic institutions, including QN, New Left alternative media production and distribution networks, and a distinctive type of individual member or community labor union that began as a New Left project to recruit young laborers into politicized anti-war groups. Much of that New Left culture remains today, along with surviving examples of its special institutions. After the New Left protest cycle ended, New Left culture, with its flat, informal organizational forms and characteristic institutions, the organizational forms as developed in Zenkyoto, and the institutions I've mentioned, survived. Since the 1970s, they have constituted an invisible alternative civil society, keeping low-key activism alive during decades when social movement activity was heavily stigmatized in the dominant mainstream society. The boundaries of this invisible civil society are difficult to define, but it consists of many hundreds, perhaps thousands, of very small social groups engaged in political advocacy on particular issues. The organizations are loose and unstable, but their members are highly skilled veterans of New Left protest who know how to study issues and develop positions, organized meetings and large events, published various types of alternative media using low-cost print technologies, and publicize their advocacy activities. Having eschewed the large national hierarchical organizations that the major New Left sects represented in their going up to a national Zengakuren, they instead came together in very informal groups with no visible institutional structure, in part because Japan's belated laws regarding nonprofits are limited and they cannot easily acquire legal status without giving up their cherished independence from the state. Consequently, their bank accounts are held officially in the name of an individual. They cannot own or rent property as an organization and therefore must do everything through placing trust in individual members. If conflicts arise, people simply walk away from these fragile organizations and form new ones. Because they are highly interconnected, such small groups can produce large, visible public events by collaborating, creating a new temporary organization that links all the relevant parties for common work. The invisible civil society is held together by network ties and overlapping memberships, embodied in the products they create through their voluntary labor, organizing events and making mini media publications to support their political advocacy goals. These products in turn provide the traces of their activity that moves from site to site. It constitutes a lively alternative sphere of activity that is usually invisible to the mainstream of Japanese society, except when it suddenly appears through a large demonstration or public event. Participation in the activities of the invisible civil society also constitute a source of personal satisfaction and identity for its individual members. To some extent, the invisible civil society is the product of a particular left-wing generation, new left generation, that has been able to incorporate relatively modest numbers of new younger members who share their advocacy goals. But its special institutions, such as community unions and the cooperative bookstores that distribute their print and other media products, and QN itself, have a longer and more stable lifespan. Some of their publications also have continued legal status under publication laws. So while it's not yet clear whether the Invisible Society, as currently constituted, can survive the passing of the new left generation that created it, it is already apparent that it has served as what sociologists call an abeyance structure, keeping alive both particular themes of political advocacy and the corpus of institutional knowledge and skills that make it possible. In the 21st century, this aging generation of new left activists has been discovered by the current generation of young people who have taken up political advocacy and are inventing their own characteristic forms, including new forms of demonstrations and their own particular creative culture. Large political demonstrations today often encompass both the old styles of the new left generation and the newer sound demo forms invented by younger activists to attract younger people who may still have negative associations with the old political forms associated with the new left. So these are the ways in which I think the new left protest cycle of the late 1960s and early 1970s has continued to be relevant in Japanese society today. Thank you very much.